welcome everybody. I'm Magda Terrer. I'm the Literature and Judaic Studies at Fordham, and I'm really excited about our low-key seminar and presentation from Hollis Granoff Landauer. So Hollis is one of our faithful participants online in our events. She's been joining us from Toronto all these few years, I guess since the pandemic started. And in the process, I have learned that she is a collector of Kibbutz Haggadot. And as many of you know, we are collecting Haggadot here at Fordham. So Hollis and I started to talk about her collection, and I visited Hollis in her home, and she showed me some amazing examples of the not only Kibbutz Haggadot, but also various songbooks and others from the early Zionist pre-state era. So we decided to go on an adventure. And Hollis bravely agreed to share her collection with us. She is not, one of those collectors who goes around and presents her work. So we are really, really grateful for her generosity in sharing her knowledge and what she has collected with us. So before I introduce Hollis, I just want to let you know that we have after Passover, so this week is our last week of workshops and seminars, and after we come back after Passover, we will have a few events coming in to close the semester. In the very first week, on Tuesday, April 18th, we have Anthony Davidson, who is here, a Dean of Education, who will be part of an event from Munkach to Manchester through the gates of Auschwitz. And the lecture is in honor of the Yom HaShoah, and he'll speak about his family's experience, his mother's experience. And he will be joined by Adele Reinhardt, who was our distinguished visiting scholar this year, who is also working through her mother's memoirs and documents who was also a Holocaust survivor. And then on Thursday that week, we have a presentation by David Myers and Nomi Stoltenberg of their book American Shtetl, the case of Kiryas Yol in New York. And it will be in a conversation with Professor Abner Green from Fordham Law School. So I hope you'll join us. I'll send a link to the events in the chat, but if you are here, it means they're probably getting our emails as either Monday morning emails or as fellows. So let me introduce Hollis, whom I had pleasure conversing over the last year or so about her work and collection. So Hollis Granoff Landauer received her BA from Mount Holyoke and then MA from Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from UCLA. And she also received a BA in library science or library degree from Simmons College. She's worked for a number of years in libraries, including in Toronto, in the University of Toronto, I think. And then she opened a design bookstore, Another Man's Poison, which was specializing in books on design, graphics, and architecture. Hollis has been collecting and studying kibbutz and kibbutz-related Haggadot for the last 25 years. And she confesses, in recent years, she's become a closet Lego builder, building facades of buildings from vintage postcards and photos. And they are really magnificent. I saw a couple of examples there. and I just sort of, it makes me long for a retirement. So Hollis, the screen is yours, and we're looking forward to learning. I just want to say that Hollis asked that if you have questions about some specific items from her collection, either email it to her or to me, and she will respond to you in the writing. It's easier that way. But go for it. Follow the screen, and everything is yours. And everyone, again, welcome.
Thank you, Magda, for this very nice introduction. I'm really happy for the opportunity to talk about Kibbutz Haggadot, a subject most people aren't familiar with, and which are really quite extraordinary. And many years ago, I approached my synagogue, which has valuable artifacts from the Cecil Roth collection, and was told that my Haggadot were late and of absolutely no interest.
Okay. Okay. Here we go.
The Kibbutz Haggadah is really a complex of printed Haggadot produced from the mid-1930s by individual kibbutzim, kibbutz federations, Zionist movements in Israel and abroad, internment camps and displaced persons camps, and the Jewish Brigade. Pictured are some examples. My talk will focus on the first category, Haggadot from individual kibbutzim. The Haggadot are fragile, and many exist in small numbers. Many Haggadot from the drug collection at the University of Toronto are online at Internet Archive, and I've taken most of my illustrations from there. On each slide, illustrations are identified by the name of the kibbutz and a publication date. The traditional Haggadah is a religious identity rite composed of 15 ritual acts. The fifth act, Magid, storytelling, tells the Exodus story in the first person exegetical midrash on Deuteronomy 26, 5-8. The Exodus story is the story of a twofold redemption, the physical transformation from slavery to freedom, and the spiritual transformation from polytheism to Judaism, the purpose of the first transformation. The traditional Haggadah also includes a second redemption, the final one, which is the subject of the second half of the Seder. With a certain degree of ambivalence and heavy hearts found in Haggadot and archival material, kibbutz members created Haggadot that responded to their particular concerns and needs. Chulada 39 describes the holiday not as one of remembrance, but of freedom lived daily by Hebrew workers in a collective based on cooperation and equality. Kibbutz Seders were secular, socialist, and Zionist. They were communal and performative. The Kibbutz Haggadah removed all traditional ritual acts. It replaced the first person exegetical midrash with the third person narrative from the book of Exodus, God's agency with that of Moses, and the return at the end of days with the Zionist return, in which the members of the kibbutz were its star participants. A New Spring section reemphasized the agricultural component of the holiday, its original incarnation. Haggadot from individual kibbutzim can be divided into two periods, before and after the establishment of the state. The Haggadot written before fall into two categories, generic and historical. The historical Haggadot describe one, events in mandatory Palestine, waves of immigration, Arab riots, white paper limitations on immigration and land, illegal immigration, stockade and tower settlements, partition, the Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence, and two, the Shoah, the Holocaust in Europe, including its prelude and aftermath. The generic Haggadot proved to be the winning model after the establishment of the state, but the historic Haggadot are Israel's finest ephemera, a tribute to the tenacity and humanity of the Zionist enterprise. Next. The historical Haggadot share a number of common features. One, socialist and or communist ideology, which define the kibbutz as an egalitarian society in terms of labor Zionism, world socialism, or both, are expressed in political prose and poetry and in local histories. Among the texts are the Hebrew translation of the Internationale by Avraham Shlansky and excerpts from the 1934 May Day article, Israel's Homegrown Socialist Text by Moshe Beilinson, the editor of the Labor Daily Davar. Ironically, Kibbutz Artsy, the most radical federation, produced the least radical Haggadot. Labor Zionism appears as part of world socialism in a 2-page spread in Afikim 46. The first page deceptively begins with the first words of the exegetical midrash, but ends, the spirit of Israel has not been struck down, and as then, so today, rebellion has not vanished, and the impulse for freedom still lives. The next page has a passage from Beilinson's May Day article. We were born with a rising sun of free people. We were there at all the battles of humanity for freedom, in all of the killing fields of the oppressed, in all of the exoduses from Egypt of every people in every generation. Both passages use terms that either appropriate the tradition or complement it. Labor Zionism as a national socialist movement appears in the local history of Afikim 37, where a member of the kibbutz describes the twofold process of redeeming and being redeemed until our people are a working people on its own land. A similar personal version appears in the Sudot Yam mentioned later, in the poem To My Country by Rachel, where the speaker finds fulfillment in planting a tree and walking the fields along the Jordan, rather than in glorious battle deeds. 2, local histories describe the history of the kibbutz, current events, and the relation of the kibbutz to socialism. They're also intimate, recording births and deaths. Enzo Sereni, one of the founders and financiers of Givat Brenner, appears in his 36 Haggadah as Chaim, his first name in Hebrew. 3, Nizkor's Let Us Remember, or Yizkor's Let the People Remember, based on the 1911 Yizkor book, provide communal memorials for those killed in pursuit of the Zionist enterprise. 4, in spite of the obvious break with tradition, the Haggadot emphasize continuity. Kibbutz Haggadot differ on the content and size of the two narratives and disagree on the relative importance of both. In some cases, the Exodus narrative is extensive, the available material ranging from the arrival in Egypt to the death of Moses and the conquest of the land under Joshua. SAR 40 goes back to creation. Non-37 not only prioritizes the Zionist narrative, but makes short shrift of the Exodus one. A sectional title page from slavery to Egypt is followed by 2 pages of local history, a page from the second iteration of Beilinson's May Day article, beginning Yatsanu, we went out to change the face of the world, and ending with the assurance in large type, that day will surely come. And a page from BERL KATZNELSON'S assertion that the Haggadah is the best pedagogical tool to teach freedom. The Exodus proper begins with, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, from the traditional Haggadah, and is reduced to 2 pages, a page of Exodus verses from the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt to the episode of the burning bush, where Moses is charged by God to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, and a page of the kibbutz version of the charge from the modern Midrash Sinai by David Frischman. At the bottom of the page is the biblical phrase, today you are leaving Egypt in the month of spring, one of 2 common kibbutz Exodus verses that don't appear in the traditional Haggadah. The Haggadah continues for another 6 pages with no further mention of the Egyptian Exodus. In the poem Mashiach by David Frischman, God keeps Messiah in chains until the Jews are ready to be redeemed. Next, in HA-HUGIM, RAANANAH, 1938, and Sudot Yam, 39, labor Zionism appears as replacement theology, where Catriel, the protagonist in David Shimoni's saga, Matzeva, a memorial, is happy with his lot because he succeeded in fulfilling the Torah of Israel. Settling the land, being satisfied with little, steadfastness. The theological challenge is reinforced by the formulation, Zot HaTorah, this is the Torah, which is part of the traditional Torah service. That it can be understood in terms of replacement is evidenced by the fact that the 37 and 38 HA-HUGIM RAANANAH the founding group of Ma'oz Chaim, don't mention the Egyptian exodus at all. Local histories assist in elevating the Zionist narrative. They're written in the style of the Bible, where the past tense is formed by a verb and the future tense preceded by a vav, and call themselves by names with religious connotations, such as Megillah, scroll, Parashah, the weekly Torah portion, Masechet, a Talmud tractate. The local history of Nes Tzionah 38 introduces itself with the words mitzvah l'saper, replacing the command to tell the Exodus story with the command to tell its own story. While appropriating biblical style and traditional terms add gravitas, they position the Zionist narrative at least on a par with the Exodus.
Hollis?
Yeah. What happened? Ironically, a case for the prioritization of the Zionist narrative.
Magda, can you hear us?
Oh, do you have the next slide? I'm sorry. Ironically, a case for the prioritization of the Zionist narrative can be found in the Bible in Jeremiah 23:7-8 and in Talmud Brachot 12b, which includes the verses, and 13a, where the Exodus story is downgraded or altogether replaced. Excerpts from these passages appear in both Hazareah 39 and Givat Brenner 41. In the Hazareah, they appear on its first page. To add insult to injury, these Gemara passages are a further discussion of Mishnah Bracha 1:5, which appears in the traditional Haggadah in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, in a completely different context. The integration of the Zionist story is accomplished in two different ways. In the simplest and cleanest approach, it appears in the second part of the Haggadah in place of the traditional Haggadah's final redemption and is implicitly a replacement of it. The breadth and depth of the literature is astounding. The excellence of the Haggadot can be attributed to 5 factors. 1, the rebranding of Bible and narrative midrash as national folklore. 2, the revival and explosion of Hebrew literature begun in the late 19th century. 3, an active book and newspaper industry. In addition to the usual subjects, newspapers published polemical prose and poetry. The poet Natan Alterman had a regular column in Davar, the 7th column. Not always, I found, in the 7th column. At the same time, poetry was converted into song, where group sing-alongs were a popular form of entertainment. 4, the intelligence and cleverness of their compilers, who had a command of both traditional and modern sources and used and abused traditional religious material. 5, the exigencies of the times. Given time constraints, this talk will deal with 3 subjects: ALIYOT, waves of immigration, Arab riots, and illegal immigration. Next. Between 1882 and 1939, there were 5 waves of immigration to mandatory Palestine, known as ALIYOT, ascents, the term used in the Bible for entering Israel. The ALIYOT were triggered by different events and ideologies. Each had its own characteristics and made its own contributions to the state. The ALIYOT appear in a number of 1930s Haggadot. Writers note their improbability. In David Shimoni's memorial mentioned earlier, someone asks, what other people have sons who go crazy and run off to live among desolate rocks? Uritz V. Greenberg in the Earthly Jerusalem describes the phenomenon as a compulsion. We were compelled to go forth, leaving behind everything they loved, knowing that their idyllic existence would someday come to an end. Excerpts from the Greenberg appear in Non 36. The beautifully illustrated Haggadot of Givat Brenner 35 and 6, and an outliner, Kibbutz HaGhagim RAANANAH 1937, offer important treatments of the ALIYOT. The Givat Brenners place the Zionist narrative in a short continuum. Both mention the Babylonian return from exile and refer to the ALIYAH of the Hasidim. The 35, with a music staff with the words Hasidic Nigunim tunes, Both contain excerpts from London's Masada, The Chain Is Not Yet Broken, all of which serve to normalize the Zionist return. Both describe the first 4 ALIYOT in polemical or historical prose and song or poetry, the 5th by the local history of the kibbutz. Next, music and singing were important features of kibbutz seders. Many of the earliest songs were based on Russian songs and tunes, Yiddish and Hasidic tunes, or Arabic tunes. Here are selections from the 3 songs of the first 3 ALIYOT in Givat Brenner 36. Hurry, Brothers, Hurry, Work Song, and Song of the Pioneers. Can you get the next one?
No.
No? Okay. All of the songs are interesting for a variety of reasons. Pictured here on the lower right is Work Song by Noach Shapira, the song of the second Aliyah. What appears to be a simple paean to work, a popular music genre, turns out to be a masterpiece of subversion. 1, it appropriates the music of an Arab folk tune, and its refrain mimics the sounds of the Arabic to serve its own purpose. 2, the genre itself is revolutionary. Labor Zionism had to deal not only with the deformed economic structure of the Jewish community, but with the stigma of physical labor as opposed to learning Torah. 3, all stanzas contradict traditional values in fact. In the first stanza, Uru Achai, awake my brothers, awake, don't sleep, get up and go to your work, is a far cry from Uru Achim in Isaiah 51:9 and 52:1. Awake, awake, clothe yourself with splendor, O arm of the Lord. The second stanza's assertion that the world stands on work is a bold contradiction of Avot 1:8, that the world stands on 3 things: Torah, Avodah's divine service, and Gemilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Avodah legitimately refers to both divine service and work. In the third stanza, the assertion, work is our entire life, replaces Torah and mitzvot, commandments, as our life and the length of our days in a common prayer. The assertions in stanzas 3 and 4 that work saves us from all troubles and provides bread to eat and clothing to wear replace God as the savior and provider in other Bible verses. Next. In 1937, HA-HUGIM RAANANAH, the founding group of Kibbutz Ma'oz Chaim, produced an amazing HAGGADAH, which, like the 38 mentioned earlier in the context of replacement theology, doesn't mention the Egyptian Exodus at all. In addition to polemical prose and poetry, it goes into considerable detail listing the accomplishments of the ALIYOT. I've included pages from the first 3 ALIYOT with English translations. Please take a look at them. I'll also describe some of the important events. The first Aliyah was a pre-Zionist Aliyah that established moshavot, settlements based on Arab labor that weren't economically viable and were eventually taken over by the Baron Edmund Rothschild and his administrators. BERL was a student organization that advocated collectivism and opposed exploitative farming practices and the use of Arab labor. The term for Arab labor, avodah zarah, foreign alien labor, is a pejorative and also means idle worker. Finally, in 1897, Theodor Herzl officially established the Zionist movement with the first Zionist Congress at Basel in 1897. The list is followed by 2 songs: Raise the Standard and Flag Toward Zion, its call for the formation of a society reflecting the settlement society of the first Aliyah, and Here in the Land of Our Father's Delight, which reflects the religious orientation of the first Aliyah and mentions the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language. Next. The second Aliyah was the first socialist Aliyah. Though the socialists constituted a small percentage of the immigrants, they were the immigrants who changed the face of the Zionist movement. Its goals were described as conquest. The heading describes kibush avodah, the conquest of labor. the normalization of the economic structure of Jewish workers by its extension to all sectors of the economy. Various short-lived experiments in communal living eventually led to the establishment of Degania in 1911, the first kibutz or permanent communal settlement, changing the term from one previously applied to communal groups in general to a fixed settlement. Kibbutz Hashmirah, the conquest of guard duty, was realized with the establishment of Hashomer, the watchman, in 1911. Joseph Chaim Brenner and A.B. Gordon were the two major inspirational ideologues of the period. Brenner was a somewhat optimistic pessimist whose realistic depictions of the hardships of settlement life prepared pioneers for the challenges ahead. Gordon's religion of labor envisioned the redemptive power of a return to nature and the soil. The list is followed by two poems, Work Song mentioned earlier, which extols work, and Rejoice Galileans on the Watchmen of the Galilee. Next. The third Aliyah was a continuation of the second Aliyah. The heading reflects on the anonymity and despair of the railroad builders. The Balfour Declaration actually appeared 2 years earlier in 1917 and viewed with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Tel Chai was the first clash between Arabs and Jews in 1920. More will be said in the discussion on Arab riots. HA-HUGIM, the pioneer, established in 1905, became the largest Zionist organization and a major source of immigrants. Also, I might add, a major producer of very good hagadot. Illegal immigration by blockade breakers, usually associated with later voyages, actually began in this period. Between 1919 and 1922, called in Hebrew the period or Fellowship of the Roads, the British government invested in infrastructure projects undertaken by both temporary and more permanent communal groups, like the Labor Brigade, established in 1920, which established settlements and advocated a countrywide network of them. Beginning at the end of the second Aliyah, major land purchases were made in the Jezreel Valley to further the goal of kibbutz hakarka, the conquest of the land. Redemption of the land was a twofold process in which the person who redeemed the land was himself redeemed. Shlomo Lavi advocated for a big kibutz, and the kibbutz was born with the establishment of Ein Harod in 1921. And in 1920, labor groups consolidated in the formation of a joint labor federation, the Hisna Group. The list is followed by excerpts from We're Torn, lamenting the plight of the pioneer. Next. The third Aliyah continues on a second page. The dance in the heading is a dance of redemption. The list is followed by two poems, a paean to the quarry worker, a participant in the government infrastructure project, and the refrain from There's Tea and Rice in China, another reflection on the sorry lot of the pioneer. Next. The San Remo Conference in 1920 established the British mandates in Palestine and Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, the British had promised Palestine to both the Arabs and the Jews. The 1920s and 30s were marked by Arab riots directed against both the Jews and the British in 1920, 21, 29, and 36 to 39. The revolts were a response to Jewish waves of immigration and set off a series of British policy papers known as white papers and limitations on Jewish immigration and settlement. The Hebrew refers to the riots as Ma'ora'ot, literally events, followed by the Hebrew date. The Arab names are both more specific and more dramatic. The 1920 Jerusalem riots are called an intifada. The first major clash between Arabs and Jews took place in 1920 at one of the northernmost settlements, Tel Chai, where Yosef Trumpeldor sent to reinforce the settlements, and 6 others were killed by Lebanese militias, not Palestinian Arabs. Tel Chai became a rallying cry, signifying heroism, the glorification of those killed in battle, and the determination not to abandon settlements. Their deaths were memorialized in the East Core Communal Memorial by BERL KATZNELSON and emblazoned on a lion monument by Avraham Melnikov in 1934, who actually went to a Cairo zoo to see what a lion looked like. The Dera 36 lionizes the martyrs in the words of the revisionist, Zev Jabotinsky, from generation to generation, there's no purer blood than the blood of the plowman of Tel Chai. And Tel Chai is burned, but the heart of Israel lives, by Yosef Chaim Brenner. The Great Arab Revolt began in 36, not long after the appearance of printed Haggadot, and figures prominently in the main body of texts and in local histories. The literature in newspapers and books was widely available. In 1937, Bracha Chabas published Me'orot Tartzav, the 36 riots, a 696-page volume on them, and the literature in Haggadot is substantial. Local histories describe the riots as days of rage, siege and blood. The local histories of Givat Brenner 37 and Givat Shlosha 39 tell the same story. Trees uprooted, granaries set on fire, loss of property and life. But the kibbutz soldiers on, accepting new immigrants and expanding. Defiam 1939 demonstrates the defiance and steadfastness of the kibbutzim with the song "We Won't Move" by Yaakov Kahan, actually written in 1921 and dedicated to Brenner and the rest of the victims of the Jaffa riots. It asserts, "We're for peace and you're for battle. We're few and you're many." And with regard to settlements, in the place one falls, 10 will rise. In the place of 10, 10,000 will stand mightily. The local history of Givat Brenner 37 describes the cruelty of the Arabs, robbers lying in wait for innocent passerbys and workers, showing no mercy to women and children, killing doctors and nurses who treated them. While Shamir 40 contrasts their behavior with that of the Jews in lines from "This Will Be Our Revenge." Essentially, it says, we're small, but we don't attack pregnant women with axes, burn the roofs of houses, or bash the skulls of infants. The revenge is the destruction of the humanity of the perpetrators by their heinous deeds, and the curse or wish, may our revenge live on. May one generation bequeath it to the next. The page, nonetheless, seems to begin with a backup plan. The first words from the traditional Haggadah's call, Shvo Chamacha, for God to pour out his wrath against those who don't recognize his name, i.e. the persecutors of Jews. The poem was written by Shaul Shenechovsky in Odessa in 1920, dedicated to the victims of the Ukrainian massacre of the previous year. But the idea of upholding moral standards, even in war, is critical to the mindset of the Yishuv and continues in the ethos of the Haganah today. Alexander Ziskin Rabinovitz, the editor of the 1911 Yizkor book, writes, "We will not follow their paths, nor do as they do," imbued, as it were, with Judaism's life-affirming and prophetic traditions. And in an untitled poem by Anda Pinkerfield, the speaker says, "We're not savages," and calls to the Arab daughter, "Cry when you see the savagery of your son." Like most members of the Yishuv, the compilers of the Haggadot don't understand the nationalist dimensions of the Arab riots. Givat Brenner 37 calls the perpetrators criminals and bands of robbers, stirred up by insiders. Next. Ineret 37 sees the riots as pogroms, placing them alongside the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648 and 9, and the Russian pogroms of 1881 and 2 and 1903 and 6. Pictured here are two of the 3 pages. The first passage on the riot, "How long, Ad Matai," is an excerpt from the most important polemical prose on the riots, an article by Bailenson in his daily column, popularly known as the reason or essence of the battle. How long, people ask, how long? In short, the battle will continue until the enemy knows that it can't break the strength of Israel in its own land, because the necessity of life and the truth of life are with it, and the enemy will have to accept it. This is the Tam HaMaracha, the essence of the battle. The article remains relevant, and excerpts are reprinted throughout the period. Non 49 applies it to the War of Independence. Tel Yosef 37 implicitly sees the riots as pogroms by pairing on the slaughter, written by Bialik after the Kishinev massacre in 1903, and Our Nights Are Under Siege, written by Shin Shalom on the 36 riot. Next. As the Arab riots increased in intensity, the Yishuv adopted a more militant response. This is illustrated by two poems of David Shimoni, pictured in Davar, but which also appeared in Haggadot. Don't Mourn, written in 1921 after the Jaffa riot, states, don't mourn, don't weep. Plowman plow, sower sow. Well, no, we won't let our blood be shed in vain, was written on the 36 riots. From the second stanza, but here we will not be like a withering leaf, like a leaf driven wherever the wind blows. Here we will not meet death like sheep. Here we will not be struck by a rod on the cheek. We will confront death and we will live. A beautifully evocative poem by Shin Shalom, Those Who Sow at Night, describes simple men sowing by the light of the moon. On Guard by Shaul Chernichovsky describes the watchman going without sleep to protect mother and father, plants and cattle, wife and children. Here they're both pictured in Ginei Gar 39. Next. Kinneret 39 and Kibbutz 39 have dedicated sections with cover pages on the riots. The Kinneret Under Siege has 3 poems. Indeed, The Days of Darkness have returned by Yaakov Kahan, Song of the Children Under Siege by Yaakov Orland, Their Fears Assuaged by Their Watchman Father, and 5 by Shin Shalom on 5 road builders murdered by Arabs outside Jerusalem in 1937, after whom the settlement Ma'aleh HaChamisha is named. The poem is followed by a short list of historic persecution, followed by the assurance of Exodus 3:2, the bush burns but is not consumed. Next. Kibbutz Hashlosha 39 in the Days of Siege and Fortress includes the 1936 Nizkor by Yaakov Fichtman and 2 other poems by Shin Shalom, A Child Cries in the Hebrew Darkness and Voices in the Night. Are you ready? I'm ready. 2 of the 5 pages of its local history also deal with the riots. Next. Fichtman's Nizkor, Let the People Remember, like Bailenson Essence of the Battle, appears frequently in 1930s Haggadot, replaced later by more general memorials that include the victims of other events. It's clearly written for the 36 riots, a call to remember isolated settlements, peaceful farmers, uprooted plants, each drop of youthful blood. The Nizkor appears on the first page of Ramat HaKovesh, an isolated settlement which was attacked many times during the 36 riots. Excerpts in Vivat Brenner are followed by a call to carry in our hearts the souls of the burning forests and the pain of the uprooted groves. Engev 39 also has a Yizkor for trees. Let the people of Israel remember the many trees that were murdered and revive their souls in a new project of creation. These Yizkors reflect both the centrality of planting trees in the Zionist enterprise and the special role of trees in Judaism. The 15th of the Hebrew month of Shvat is a new year for trees, and planting trees even takes precedence over greeting the Messiah. Next. In spite of Arab resistance and British legislation, immigration was a Zionist imperative, which became more acute in the wake of the Holocaust. The White Paper of 1939, issued in response to Arab riots and Arab demands, severely limited Jewish immigration. In spite of the Holocaust, the British refused to open the gates to Palestine. The Yishuv responded with ALIYAH Bet, ALIYAH Bilti Legalit, illegal immigration. The first voyage, organized by HA-HUGIM in 34, ended with the successful landing of passengers on the Velos. And in 1938, operations were taken over by the Haganah's Mossad ALIYAH Bet. In 1939, Zev Jabotinsky, the revisionist leader, declared free immigration the recommended national sport. And Ben-Gurion declared the intention to fight the White Paper as if there were no Hitler, and to fight Hitler as if there were no White Paper. There were 2 waves of illegal immigration, Hapala, literally daring or audacity, before and during the war, and Bricha, flight or escape after the war. Both terms come from the Bible. In Numbers 14:44, the Israelites dared to go up the hill or hill country against the Amalekites. Exodus 14:5 describes the Exodus as a flight. The first term represents the daring of the first phase, The second, the determination and desperation of the second. The ships were old and rickety and conditions abroad very poor, and the journeys perilous. The literature of the voyages fall into two categories: non-specific poetry and prose, and news and eyewitness accounts and poetry and prose related to particular voyages. The literature is substantial and the polemical prose among the most important of the period. Next. The determination of the Yishuv to break the blockade by any means is expressed in an article, What is the Real Meaning of Heroism, by Balanson in Davar. We'll take every path. If the gate is open, we'll go through the gate. If a crack is open, we'll go through the crack. Both through the gate and through the crack. With sweat and blood, we'll redeem the land. Kibbutzim played a major role in the landings, and their members were active in the Haganah, which directed the operations. One of the interesting aspects of Kibbutz Haggadot is the pairing of passages. The ALIYOT 47 pairs the passage with Bialik's iconic phrase, "We're the last to be enslaved and the first to be redeemed from dead of the desert." The 44 with verses from the refugee ship, the Colorado, mentioned later. Next. The labor leader, BERL KATZNELSON, eloquently stressed the urgency and obligation to save refugees before the war in a speech to the 21st Zionist Congress in 39, when there was still hope, and toward the end of the war in 43, when it was clear all hope was lost. Both frequently appear in Haggadot. The most common passage from the 39 speech is abandoned at sea are those who carry the banner of the suffering of the Jews. They won't allow the gates of the land to be closed. They won't let the conscience of the world rest in peace. The Jewish refugee stands at the forefront of the battle, and we have to follow in its ranks. The Givat Brenner 41 begins with a previous line explaining the passage. Who in our day are the natural standard bearers of the fate of Israel's struggle for its existence? Givat Chaim 41 notes with irony from the same text that the fate of the Jewish people lies in the hands of the common people, a rather strange statement for a labor leader, and asks what immigration is legitimate and legal, if not that of the Jewish people. Ironically, Jabotinsky, the revisionist, had no doubts about rank and file Jews, as expressed in his version of the Four Sons. Next. The 1943 plea states, if we weren't able to rescue those taken to their death, we, the saved, are responsible for the remnant of Israel. There are no other shoulders to carry them. There are no backs behind which to hide. Every day, a person must see him or herself as one who tips the scale to leave Egypt or to lengthen the exile. May all of our efforts be directed to splitting the sea and welcoming the returnees. 3 of the 4 pages pictured here paired the statement with passages of resilience, despair, or defiance from polemical prose, Bible verses, or poetry. The poem in Sidot Yam, Kaisaria, is Blessed is the Match by Chana Senesh, the paratrooper who was captured and put to death in 44, written before her execution. The ship named after her will be discussed later. Next. The pages of Afikim are shown right to left as they appear in the Haggadah to preserve the integrity of the graphic. They juxtapose the first part of the plea, if we weren't able to save the victims of the Shoah, on the left, with the Katznelson passage calling Passover the best pedagogical tool to teach freedom. And the second part, to see oneself as tipping the scales, also on the left, with a traditional injunction to see oneself leaving Egypt. Next. Haggadot include a wide variety of poetry, new and old. Only a few are mentioned here. The emblematic poem and song of the period is Immigrants by Yitzhak Shenhar, pictured here in Ramat Rachel 40. In the dark, a ship gropes the shore, a tired sun returns to you. It was written after the landing of the Velos and first appeared on a Jewish National Fund song card, another transmission route for poetry. Many Haggadot include verses from On Ben Pella by Shin Shalom, parts of which also appeared in Davar. Among the recycled poems are At the Gate, a beautiful evocative poem of being locked out of the promised land by Bialik, written in 1922, Ascenders, Mapirim, written by Levin Kipnis on a youth trip to the Judean desert in 1914. And We Go Up and Sing, written by Yaakov Kahan in 1903 after the Kishinev massacre. The last two can be forgiven for their inclusion. The first because of its title and wording based on Numbers 1444, the source of the term Hapalah. The second for mentioning ruins and corpses. The theme of opening the gates, which appears in Isaiah for the righteous to enter, becomes opening the gates for illegal immigrants and appears in poetry and prose versions. Next. Other texts revisit passages from the traditional Haggadah. Mishmar HaEmek 40, which has a large concentration of Hapalah literature, asks, Ma nishtana, how is this night different? Replacing the 4 ritual acts with the text interweaving Exodus and modern themes. Among the lines, a remembrance of Egypt, a remembrance of exiles, Babylonia, Spain, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, a remembrance of a basket of reeds, Teva Gomez, a remembrance of the Struma, Teva Struma, a remembrance of the splitting of the sea pursued by Egyptian horsemen, a remembrance of the splitting of the Mediterranean Sea pursued by British airplanes and patrol boats. Next. Specific voyages also appear. The Asimi arrived in April 39 and was intercepted and brought to Haifa. In spite of protests and a general strike, the passengers were ultimately deported. Azariah of 1940 includes an appeal of the passengers, we, the prisoners of the Asimi, to the merciful, the civilized world, and the great and terrible British government, Hatzilu, save us. Mishmar HaEmek 40 has a congratulatory note, Mazel Tov, to a passenger on the birth of a son, a citizen of the land that expelled the father. Both are excerpted from articles in Davar. Next. The Colorado was a Mossad ship that sailed from Romania in July 39 with 388 passengers. Next. The poet Gidel Mishkovsky, a passenger on the ship, wrote a series of short poems, Songs of the Colorado, with mostly rhyming titles. The poems were published in Davar, and lines from poems appear in Revivim 44 and Ramat Rachel 40, as well as in the ALIYOT 44 mentioned earlier. Next, among the voyages were several tragedies, the Salvador, the Patria, and the Struma. The Struma, which left Romania in December 41, arrived in Istanbul, where it was eventually towed to open waters and sunk by a Russian submarine, with one survivor out of around 800 passengers and crew. Afikim 42 has 2 pages on the Struma, including the traditional morning invocation, may their souls be bound up, linking the deaths on the Struma with those of the Patria and Salvador, and a graphic of the ship exploding. Ivat HaShlosha 42 has parts of the eyewitness accounts of its sole survivor, David Stolia. The tragedies of the lost ships and the deportees are mentioned a number of times. Sarif 41 invokes the memory of those killed on the Patria and the deportees of the Atlantic. The Mishmar HaEmek 40 mentioned earlier is followed by a Yizkor exclusively devoted to illegal immigrants. Let the people of Israel remember the pure souls of its sons and daughters who illegally immigrated by every means. They tore up decrees, breached boundaries amidst raging waves of the sea, sailed to Eretz Yisrael, saw it from afar, but never entered it. The last line employs the language of Deuteronomy 30-52, where Moses is allowed to look at the land from afar, but not enter it. Other Yizkors mention the victims of the illegal immigration alongside the victims of other tragedies. Next. The voyages of the second period include the Chanasenish, named after the parachutists mentioned earlier, and the Exodus. While most of the ships of the second period were intercepted, the Chanasenish successfully landed its passengers in December of 45. The poet Natan Alterman witnessed the landing and wrote a tribute to its captain. Mocking the British, he calls the events the nation's battle of Trafalgar. Kuladas Vihisha Amda, it's that which stood by us, like the verses from the exegetical midrash mentioned earlier, is an example of the Kibbutz Haggadah's use of core passages from the Maggid section for its own purpose. According to the passage, in every generation, there are those who rise up against us, but God saves us. Here, God is removed, and the Savior is the Chanesenesh, portrayed in a line drawing. The Exodus, the most famous ship, known in Hebrew as the Exodus from Europe, 1947, sailed from France in July 47 with 4,500 survivors. The brutal attack by the British and the deportation back to Germany is described by its radio operator in Ma'oz Chaim 48. The outcry following this outrageous act led the British to terminate the mandate. In conclusion, the historic Haggadot of the pre-state years are Israel's finest ephemera, a record of its history largely through polemical poetry and prose, and a testament to the humanity of the Zionist enterprise. Its range of material is staggering, from the Bible to the most up-to-date literature. The modern literature is in dialogue both with classic literature and with itself. Given the huge diversity of material and a very large number of Haggadot and the time constraints of this lecture, this talk only began to touch on 3 of the available topics. Thank you again, Magda, for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you. If there are questions, I can be contacted at landauer@rogers.com. I've also given Magda a short English bibliography.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Because I'm trying my computer. Hollis, this was really an incredible presentation, such a rich history. We don't see you on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it really, I think you conveyed magnificently what kind of lost history is recorded in these Haggadot. It's really fascinating with the not just poems but reports and survivors' accounts and passages of speeches and things like that. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. What I wanted to ask you is a question about the choice of color. I think you made a very persuasive reason why these are such a fascinating material. But as you started saying in the very beginning, not everybody understands their value. So how did you get into collecting those Haggadots?
Well, I was looking for a Jewish collectible, and I noticed that eBay was selling Kibbutz Haggadot. And I attended a Seder at Givat Brenner in 1965. So it went from there. I was fortunate that when I was at least began collecting, there was a very large number of Haggadot for sale, and very good ones, including very good ones. I'd like to give special thanks to the late Amiram Zak and his wife, Rosette, from whom I purchased many good Haggadot, as well as Shai Mendelevitz from his time at the auction house, Kedem, who shared his expertise and advice with me because he understood the importance of the Haggadot that were at auction. His scans allowed me to make good bidding decisions.
And how did you decide to focus on the pre-state Haggadot, on that particular snippet of history and production of these?
Well, because they're the really interesting Haggadot. I mean, once the state was established, basically they're very pared down generic models, which aren't very interesting. Yeah,
I found it interesting because they capture sort of individual kibbutzim, but also these individual stories that you so well show in the examples that you've had. So I'm very grateful for your generosity in sharing this fantastic material, and we see in chat already. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful talk. So I know this was a lot of work, because that's not your normal thing to do, to give talks about your fascinating material, but it was a really wonderful, and I'm so grateful that at this time you were able to share with us this incredible rich material.
Thank you.
I think you can give more talks. No, so thank you all for joining us. And again, if you have any questions or any comments, or you want more information, either reach out to Hollis or to me directly, and I will forward that material to Hollis. And again, Hag Pesach Kasher V'Sameach, although they probably were not that interested in the kashrut, but wonderful material. So thank you, and Rachel, thank you too for sharing your screen and shepherding the technology through for all of us. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Hollis, for this wonderful, wonderful talk.
And thank you.
My perseverance worked. It was worth it. I'm so glad it was worth it.